Today at Deutsche Auto Parts, we're going to be going over how to install rear pads and rotors on a MK7 GTI. Okay, so before we get into our install, I want to talk a little bit about what we're installing and why we're doing it, and some of the options that we offer on our site. For a link to anything we offer in regards to MK7 brake kits, which would be pads, rotors, all different stuff like that, I'll put a link here where you can check out the actual kits that we've assembled, because keep in mind, we've actually assembled all these kits together on our own. So what we're going to be installing is slotted Stoptech rotors, and then we're going to be doing EBC red stuff pads. Now we offer two different versions of the EBC pads, the EBC red stuff and then the EBC yellow stuff. The main difference you're going to find on EBC red versus yellow is red are for street use and yellow is really more for track use, can be used on street, but they're a pretty aggressive brake pad and shouldn't generally be used for street use just because of some of the characteristics of what track pads are really intended for. What the difference would be is on a track pad, the one thing that is going to be always an issue is they're not going to be functioning at their optimum performance until they're warm, so you would have to heat them up. They would also tend to be more likely to squeal under colder conditions, which may not be something that you're going to want on a daily drive car. If you're okay with that, track pads might be the best choice for you. They are going to give you better stopping power in general and bite harder when you do brake. Whichever one you choose, you will want to bed the brake pads. That is basically where you are mating the brake pad surface to the rotors. You shouldn't just install the brakes and then slam on your brakes as soon as possible to test them out and see how good they are, because they haven't worn in together and they're not going to function the best they possibly can if you do that. I'll put a link to the information that EBC has in regards to their recommended brake pad bedding in the description below, where you can check out more info on that. Again, support for purchases of stuff like this or any other from our site helps support videos just like this one. Let's get into our install. Okay, so before we get into our install, I want to take a quick note. Before we do anything, there's a few things you need to definitely make sure you know when doing rear brakes on any VW or Audi, pretty much current model. First, number one, this car does not have electronic rear parking brakes, but other MK7s do, specifically the MK7 Golf R. If you have a vehicle that you're trying to do rear brakes on that has electronic rear parking brakes, you will need to detract the pistons electronically using a VAGCOM or some other scan tool like that to detract the piston for the electronics. Otherwise, you risk damaging the complete rear caliper, which can be obviously a big problem because you'll have to replace the entire caliper, which generally gets pretty expensive on calipers like that. You're talking about usually $300, $400, $500. So that's one note. Next note. Retracting the pistons, unlike a front one where you can just squeeze them and push them in, on rear brakes on all VW or Audis, you have to actually twist and push the rear caliper in at one time. This requires a special tool, and we're going to be using this one, which we'll see later on what you're going to need to do that. I'll put a link to the options we have for that brake caliper tool, where you can check it out here to find out more info on that specifically. Okay, so we're going to be taking off our rear wheel. One note you want to have is if you're on the ground and you're going to be working on jack stands, you want to break all your lug nuts loose first and then jack the vehicle up so that you can take the wheels off. We are using air, so we're going to go ahead and remove our rear wheel. Also, one note I want to make about this. I actually have a habit of always putting my rear parking brake on because it's just a habit of driving a manual. You cannot do a repair like this with your parking brake on, so you will want to have it disengaged when you're doing this install. Alright, so here we are on the passenger side rear caliper, we have our 13 millimeters that hold on the rear caliper, and we need to break them loose. So we are going to do so, and once you break them loose, you see, if you take a look here, once you break these loose, this spins with it. So what we need to do is hold that. I actually don't have a wrench that's thin enough to fit in there, so we got to improvise with a pair of needle nose vice grips, but they'll get the job done. Doesn't need to be too terribly sophisticated to do that, because all you're really doing is holding that to make sure that it doesn't move. Once we've done that, our caliper can now come off. And then swing out of the way here. Actually happens to be a decent place to just rest right here. The line holds it in place here. Okay, so we've tied our caliper up out of the way. It probably doesn't need to be tied up this far out of the way. I only did so that we can proceed to see the rest of our install. Just make sure that the line just doesn't get stretched too much, because you don't want to end up breaking this brake line off. Otherwise, you'll really regret that. So let's proceed by take our brake pads out. It's usually easiest to grab like a small flathead screwdriver and just pop them out. Okay, so here we are looking from the back of the caliper and carrier assembly. We need to remove the caliper carrier, which uses these two 14 millimeter triple squares. So that is something that you're not going to have readily available to you unless you already own a set of triple squares. We'll put a link to the triple squares we offer in the description, but this is going to be something that is required for this install. All right, last bolt is out. We're going to pull our carrier out. Now, something that a lot of people, if you're, for time purposes, we're not going to mess with it, but a lot of people might want to clean up their stuff. So you're going to need some pretty good cleaners to get rid of all this brake dust and everything. All right, so next we're going to take off our rotor set screw. We're going to be using air. This is a T27 Torx. You would want to break that loose maybe right when you take the wheel off, because it will spin, and if you're using a ratchet or something like that that doesn't spin fast like this, you would have a tough time actually breaking it loose. So we're just going to kick it out like that, and if you don't have air, you're going to have to kind of plan a little more thoroughly to get that taken off. A couple other notes about rotor set screws. As vehicles age, you know, this is a pretty low mileage car, but as vehicles age, they tend to rust, especially in northern parts. We don't really deal with that where we are, but what you would get instances where you would end up having a tough time getting that screw out, and you'd have to drill it out. The other alternative to people in the industry would use something like this. This is called an impact driver, where you would take this, and this is a Phillips head, but you would use the Torx bit and then hit it with a hammer while it turns, and it's an impact to break things like that loose. So this is something just to be aware of. A tool that does exist for instances like this. Next thing we got to do to take our rotor off, because as you see it's on there even though the set screw's out, is we thread a bolt in, and then we just hit it with a hammer on the edge of the rotor, and you see it breaks it loose. Alright, so we're ready to reinstall our slotted rotor. You want to make sure that whenever you're putting performance rotors on, they generally are directional. So this one says R, it's for the right side. We know that we are good. Let's line up our rotor set screw and get that mounted in place. Okay, so here we are. We're looking at our brake caliper. If we take a look here, there are notches here, and if we look at our tool here, there are notches that are in there. We are going to fit the notches, and a lot of times these tools have multiple settings on them, or multiple tips that have different alignments. So you want to make sure you use the right one that fits the vehicle. And what we're going to do is turn this in place. Now keep in mind, as this goes back, you have to continue to thread this so that it stays tight. So one thing you want to make sure of whenever using this is make sure that the boot is moving freely. And some people even like to spray like silicone in there to keep the boot kind of lubed up so it doesn't get bound up, because if it gets bound up, you could risk tearing the boot while doing brake pads. If you tear the boot, your caliper will have to be refurbished. All right, so I turned until it's now hit the bottom, and we can thread our tool out and mount our caliper carrier and everything in place with the brake pads. All right, now we're going to reinstall our carrier. And something to be aware of is that these bolts are intended for one-time use according to VW, so they technically should be replaced whenever doing this install. And then the torque spec on these is going to be 90 degrees plus 90 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. So we're going to first torque them down to 90 Newton meters each. Then we're going to turn them an additional 90 degrees, quarter turn. All right, so we did both of our 90 Newton meters. Now we're going to do our 90-degree turns. And now we have tightened our carrier. Okay, so as we proceed with our install, we can install our rear pads. And we're just going to swing them in place and kind of push these springs in. Okay, so now our pads are all installed. We're going to take our brake caliper, mount it back in place, and put our two 13s back on. And we're going to be torquing these bolts to 35 Newton meters as per their spec. Okay, so one really quick and important note as we're winding down our install, want to talk about a brief and really important part of installing brakes on a car. This would be front or rear. Most importantly, anytime you retract the piston on any brake caliper, you will need to get in the vehicle and pump the brake pedal before you even think about moving the vehicle. The reason why this is because if you try to just get in there and drive the vehicle, the brake caliper piston is not pushed out far enough to actually stop the vehicle and hit the pad completely. So what you'll need to do is pump up the pressure to allow that piston to kind of move out to its stopping point, and that way you'll have brakes when you go to actually attempt to stop. Failing to do so could result in a serious problem and likely an accident. So be sure you do this, and let's watch the rest of our install. Okay, so now we've finished with our install. we're going to reinstall our wheels, and we're going to be using our wheel stud tool to do so. This will help with making it easier to put our wheel on and not struggle with it because the bolts aren't lining up. Slide that in place, put our bolt on. We're now going to put our bolts on, tighten our wheels, and then repeat the same process for the other side. Thank you so much for watching our Mark 7 rear brake DIY. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.